Hello.
Well, good evening and welcome to the first Two Big Egos in a Small Car podcast of 2025. Happy New Year to all our listeners and Happy New Year to our guest for this evening. Graham is joining us as we speak. Welcome, Graham. Happy New Year to you as well.
Happy New Year to you, Charles, and Grant.
And
Hi, Graham. Happy New Year.
we're just welcoming Grant for the evening. So our first guest of the year is Grant McPhee. And thank you so much for joining us, Grant. Grant from Cooper in Fife and Graham from Grangemouth. Grangemouth, remind me,
Not quite in Fife.
Scottish. Where's that exactly in Scotland? In Scotland?
Oh, is that to me or
Face Fife? It's on the first to fourth. Virtually faces Fife, yeah.
Yeah. So how far from each other would you be then?
Obviously, Grangemouth's much more attractive than Fife.
yeah? Well, I'm originally from Fife, but I stay in Haddington, so we're actually not that far away, Graham. So the other side of Edinburgh.
Ah,
Cool.
right.
That's excellent news.
So Grant, Scottish filmmaker, film director, cinematographer, and writer, of course. And Graham has his own roots in Scotland, seeing gigs, late 1970s, Graham, I think, 1980s is when you started.
Yeah, we can come to that later once we get into the book with Grant. But yeah. My personal life sort of like touches on parts of the book that Grant's put together so brilliantly.
So our primary reason for tonight is that Graham chose Grant's latest book for his book of the year in our 2024 roundup. And this is the second book in fairly quick succession, actually, from Grant. First one was Hungry Beat, the Scottish independent pop underground movement, 1977 to 1984, published by White Rabbit Books 2022. And then the one that Graham has given us the book of the year, Postcards from Scotland, Scottish independent music, 1983 1995, this time published by Omnibus Books in 2024, and as I say, named by Graham as the book of the year on the Two Big Egos in a Small Car. So I guess, Grant, that's the background to this. I suppose the opening question would be, why write this second book? I'm not saying why not write it, but the particular focus obviously sort of slightly crosses over with the first book, 1994 and 1983 rather. But was it more that you wanted, the first one actually perhaps took in Edinburgh and Glasgow, the second one more specifically, I think, took in Glasgow. Was that the intention behind it?
Yeah, well, first thing, thank you very much, Graham and Charles. I'm absolutely delighted that you've picked Postcards from Scotland. And the genesis of this book was very similar to Hungry Beat. Hungry Beat was co-written by Douglas McIntyre. I'd made two films, Big Gun Dream, which covered the fourth cars and fast product era of Scotland's music, and Teenage Superstars, which covered Glasgow and Edinburgh's 80s scene. And when you make a film, you really only have 90 minutes of screen time, and within that, probably have like 50 minutes to tell a story using interviews. We bring in archive, and I'd conducted like hundreds and hundreds of interviews, and there was like a far bigger story which I think needed to be told. And what we did with the Big Gun Dream outtakes was we made Hungry Beat, and this is what we did with what I did with Teenage Superstars. We used the interviews which weren't used for Postcards from Scotland, and then as I was doing it, the story just got bigger and bigger. So we conducted more and more interviews, and it just gradually got massive. It got huge.
It's all very like small reminiscences, but it's actually an epic book. There's 481 pages of tiny anecdotes and tiny little meetings and tiny little happenings, and it's a really personal book, but it feels a bit of an epic. It's sort of like a tale of two cities, except about indie bands.
Well, I think so. It's, although it is about Scotland, it's, to me, it's universal. And, I was probably doing a lot of projecting when I was writing this, because, I'm not a musician, but in my head, I've always wanted to be a musician. And it's just to me, it's the story of youthful excitement, which existed in every sort of like town and city and village throughout the United Kingdom. It was a period where you literally could imagine yourself in a band from your bedroom and make a record. And, to me, that was like incredibly exciting that these groups of like young men and women would be able to write a song in their bedroom and then find a record plant which would like press it and release it. And there was like an independent distribution network who would get this music out to people. And, I think for anyone interested in any sort of DIY autonomy, it's an exciting thing and it is universal. And I think, as Graham said, it is a microcosm of all these little stories. Everybody has a story, and the actual mechanics of writing the song is less interesting to me. It was just like all these young people imagining their sort of fantasies of being on top of the box. That's what appealed to me. Just the silliness.
It all feels completely real. It doesn't feel like there's any cliches. There's any gilding the lily. There's nobody boasting. There's no one showing off. It's all 100% genuine. So you feel like you're getting the real thing the whole time. Even though the memories of various players from various bands sometimes differs on the details, it feels totally real.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned about the sort of different recollections, and it's a bit, sort of like Rashomon, the Kurosawa film, where everybody does have like a different, memory. And, to me, it was important to put that into the book, and I know it frustrates some people, think it could just be sort of like edited down into sound bites, but, we'd done that with the films, and this was, just exploring that a little bit more. And, everybody's truth is different. And, it's not just that people, through, just like, age and memory, slightly self-indulgent or indulgent lifestyles, that you forget these things. There are differences in perspective from like a drummer to a singer, and I just wanted that everybody in the book to have their equal amount of say, regardless of whether it's like a really famous band they were in or just a small band that never released a record. I think this is everybody's. So it's culturally important to me. I think that everybody is allowed to tell their version of this time in their life.
Are musicians?
Sorry.
Go on, Graham. I'll ask mine later.
Yeah. All right. I really enjoyed Hungry Beat, but I prefer Postcards from Scotland because you recognise the stories in Hungry Beat, but in Postcards from Scotland, there's all these bands like the Green Telescope, the Cheap Gods, Rock Capella, the Child Molesters, which I'd never even heard and never became famous. They're really great stories. So, and if you tried to tell it as a traditional narrative and tried to like bring all the various recollections together into some sort of like direct stream, a straight line like a conventional book, ironically, it wouldn't be as good, I don't think.
No, thanks. Yeah, I think it's. I actually, in a moment of craziness, wrote 2 books back to back. So there's like a third volume, and I think you're absolutely right in that. There's so much like crossover between these stories that if you hold it, completely linearly, you just jump about so much that you just wouldn't be able to get any level of detail, and it's like completely confuse the reader, like a dovetail joint. They all sort of like together coalesce to tell a wider story, but you just have to imagine that whole story yourself.
Are musicians? I was wondering. I mean, as to whether musicians might be seen as being unreliable witnesses rather than reliable witnesses, given the experiences through which musicians go. And is that one of the things that's intriguing, that in some ways you then have to cipher through what's been said? And I'm not saying you have to bring your own judgment to it, but it's interesting that to have different versions of the same story, as it were, and then there's obviously a kind of writer's involvement as well. So how did you go about judging that side of the natural, unreliable witness that is there in a musician's report of their past?
Yeah, it's a good question, Charles. And it is, as I mentioned, the Rashomon narrative where everybody does have their own version of the story, and you look at it in so many different ways. If you speak to somebody now, then about their sort of recollections, it'll without a doubt vary to, in some cases dramatically if you'd asked the person at the time. But even if you'd asked somebody their thought on, some scene or situation that had happened, 10 years ago, it'd probably be different because people's lives get in the way. And, some people are just incredibly open about what happened. Some people are incredibly honest. Other people have like agendas. And, I used oral history as a way to, that is a level of truth because I'm not putting a narrative slant on it. But I think, the other end of the spectrum, and puts on the introduction that, what was really interesting to me is that I spoke to some people who this was the first time that they'd spoken about this, and I jumped in with my big boots thinking everything was exciting and this would be brilliant. And it was a really traumatic experience, and it's like affected every element of their lives. Some people have had an amazing time and some people haven't. And I think it would be unfair for what we're trying to tell to interrogate somebody as though, stick a bright light in their face. And, it's sensitive situations with a lot of people. And, I approached it in that I would, if four people have a vaguely similar recollection of experience in one person, a dramatically different experience, so you would think, well, why is that so different? And that's really the only time, unless it was something that really sort of altered a timeline where I'd really sort of interrogate them on this. You have to, you're making a story and not an encyclopedia, and you have to have an element of myth in there. And it's not a case of if it sounded would have put it in. It's really using sort of judgment. And I'm quite sensitive to people's experiences within this, and it's, as I mentioned, it's complicated like business deals or anything like that. If there was something that was very different from somebody's recollection, that would make me think, what has happened there? Why is that so different? Other than that, it's just, it's really believing these people, because, a lot of people were opening up for the first time about their experiences, and, I'm happy to accept, their version of events. And, no matter what you do, if you did use some 1970s police interrogation technique, and, you would still get, discrepancies in what people said. Some people are absolutely adamant that something happened one way, and other people say it happened in a completely different way.
That's fair to say that happens in families as well. Two brothers will often have completely different versions of how they see a reason for falling out. I mean, the tradition with music is bands form and have musical differences and fall out and split. They form when they're young, they're inexperienced in life, they're thrust into a public environment, a very exposing place. Schisms happen, fractures happen, but also greatly joyful things happens as well, as actually can happen within families as well. But the nature, it seems, within music is it can be a very quick process, the rise and the fall, the Icarus journey of a band.
Absolutely, I can completely agree with that.
There's a peculiarly Scottish thing about the interviews I mean, some of the bands are famous, like Jesus and Mary Chain and BMX Bandits, which Jens, Nirvana and America and Kurt Cobain loved. But there seems to be a Scottish thing where no one takes any great pride in any of this. Everything's down to earth and matter of fact. No one talks like a star at any point in the book.
Yeah, I think it's something that is very interesting, and I think the nature of how this music came about. This is the little brothers and sisters of the previous generation, and they had seen bands like Orange Juice from Postcard Records, sort of indie darlings, and to be able to appear on Top of the Pops, they had to dramatically tidy themselves up to be acceptable, and production-wise and image-wise. And the vast majority of these bands, I think, were quite aghast at what their heroes had to do, and it was like very much a reaction to that. And I think by the time that their turn had come around, that people were far more willing, and infrastructure had been built where they didn't have to tidy themselves up so much, and they could be a lot rawer. And I think that's probably something that's like stayed with them. I think that's why they're very much, they've never had to go through that sort of superstar schooling where you have to like really sort of like shape yourself up. Sort of very natural, and that's something to me that is about a lot of this C86 inverted commas scene, which a lot of people hate, is something that is. I think it is a very good point you've made. A lot of these people aren't superstars, and that's why we ironically called the film it was based on Teenage Superstar, because they sort of are superstars, but more in the sort of like Andy Warhol sense of it, or in their heads, they're massive stars. They, other than Jesus and Mary Chain and maybe Teenage Fan Club to their extent, these bands haven't had like 100 million album sales or anything crazy like that, and I think that has led them to be quite balanced.
So, Grant, I mean, with some musicians, they want the stardom, they want the rock and roll lifestyle or whatever. I mean, this might be something of a generalization, but do you sense that the motives for forming bands in Scotland, this is a really generalized question, but is actually not rooted in perhaps what would have driven someone like, actually, even Alex Harvey is not a good example. I don't know. Anyway, not for pop stardom, but it's something else that's driving the wish to form a band.
Yeah, I think from the earlier scene, the sort of the post-punk scene, I think people it was the first time, punk changed a lot of things for people, and it was like wiping the slate clean. But I think nobody had really been through what an independent label is, and I think to people essentially, that post-punk heroes were, as you say, like Alex Harvey and a lot of like glam rock, and seeing people on Top of the Pops. And I think the generation that came just slightly after had been through, they were the children of punk rock, and they had a very sort of different attitude towards what a pop musician was. And I think record sales are very unimportant to a lot of these people. It is, while they might not want to appear on Top of the Pops, I think there's still an element of like being, there's a sort of cool factor. It's like, it is this sort of like, a superstar in their own head. And I think looking good is something I think is appealing. So I forgot your original question. I've gone off.
It was that thing of whether the driving force of wanting to form a band. I mean, I guess I would use Belle and Sebastian as an example of a band who never seemed to me to have ever been driven by a huge desire to be a hugely successful pop act, but have just loved the craft of songwriting. That seems to what's driven Stuart with that always.
Yeah, I think that's like an excellent example. Belle and Sebastian are an incredibly unique band. They would not do like interviews. They didn't, on their record covers or any promotional material they put out. They had pictures of their friends rather than them.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, and it's maybe the way that music was like presented, from Scotland, because other than Alex Harvey, sorry, with people like Alex Harvey, and I'm trying to think of other examples like Nazareth, some of the earlier bands. Everyone really had to go down to London.
Yeah.
To
Basic Rollers.
Yeah, and the Basic Rollers are a fascinating band because although they're very much like a teeny sort of bopper band, their image on TV in the 70s, when they were presented, they had like Tam Payton, their manager, and that was the first time people had really seen a band not operating from London. And I think that was like something that, Malcolm McLaren sort of very clearly was inspired by, not the music, but that somebody could like manipulate a band and do it in a very untraditional way. And I think in Scotland, because up until success of like some of these indie bands, there never really been like a Scottish identity on music other than Graham saying the Basic Rollers. And I don't think that that desire was like very different, because Scotland didn't really have a music scene before post-punk came along, and that's probably just something culturally that's been taken to very extreme and very impressive levels by Belle and Sebastian and Franz Ferdinand. But you can just do things on your own terms. You don't have to play the game. That's something
Camera Obscura as well. I mean, obviously,
yeah, absolutely,
that would apply to them as well. Graham, your question.
Yeah, I've got a couple of sort of more personal observations. A great deal, so I think that the book should make a great play on the stage. Like, it's got so much great dialogue, I can actually see these people on stage. Second thing is that the book's quite personal to me, because in the chapters about Falkirk and Grangemouth and the promoter Brian Guthrie, brother of Robin Guthrie of the Cocktail Twins, and he's putting on gigs at Granger Town Hall with the Rosillos and the Jolt and the Heat and Ultravox, Simple Minds. Well, I was actually there, and I had no idea that these things mattered, because some of those gigs had literally 90 people in the audience. And then I read a bit about low life in the guitar player in real life called Ronnie Buchanan. Well, Ranger's not a big town, and when I was 14, one of my best friends was Ronnie Buchanan, and we were going to form a comedy double act, which we never did, thank God. But then Stuart Everest pops up in Dead Neighbours, and I was like, well, I remember the name Stuart Everest, and it's almost like in something that later on would actually be history. So the whole book came as quite a shock to me.
It's I think it's fascinating, and I think you point about like Brian's like an incredibly important person in this story, and it's just like amazing that these bands he was like bringing to Grangemouth, and just as you say, like people in your street and like surrounding streets, like forming and sort of being in bands, and that's the for me the great thing. But actually sort of practically interviewing people, it's like some people, when Michael Kerr was in the same little town village as me, and it's like these people are just around, and it's like a really inspiring thing, and for you to see that growing up is amazing.
It's like a different map of the world. All these guys bothering to form bands and form record labels and promote gigs is like a different map of the world from the world you were brought up in.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But the thing is, the music though, it doesn't stop at the Scottish boundary. A lot of the bands. I mean, Graham's mentioned some obviously that haven't necessarily become as well known, but it's a phenomenal number of bands, Grant, that actually have broken through and become, started as independent, but actually ended up on major labels, and we can name any number of Scottish bands that has happened to. It's a prolifically productive country for rock music. It's an extraordinary country for rock music from that point of view, and really diverse bands as well.
Yeah, it's we use the term like indie, and it's become from a means of distributing a record to become genre. But within that, it's incredibly diverse, as you say. And I think there's just something in that. Until the late 70s, there was virtually no recording studios. There was no infrastructure at all in Scotland. So from an incredibly slow start, it's amazing that any music comes from Scotland at all. But from doing something that somehow means something to people, and it was DIY, I think, out of necessity. And I think, as Graham had mentioned, seeing somebody from your own town or city in the NME or Melody Maker or on Top of the Pops is such an inspiring thing for anybody to see, because it does show that if you come from a small place, we actually can do something that is like culturally important and means something to other people. And I think Scotland, its indie music is one of its like greatest exports, and it frustrates me that a lot of organisations, perhaps not as Creative Scotland, but what would have been the Scottish arts organisations or anyone with the ability to fund people, they don't see the value as much as the people who appreciate and buy the music do, because around the world, it's not an exaggeration to say that without the Vaselines, Nirvana certainly wouldn't exist in the way that they do from a tiny record. Yeah, I think Norman Blake and Teen Fan Club made points that there was, you put on an early Vaselines gig, and there was maybe like 15 people at it. And the chances of them even getting to make a record are less, that getting into the hands of a future megastar, 3,500 miles away, it just almost seems like a fairy tale, but it happens. And the other thing with like Teenage Fan Club bands, you mentioned some major labels, and it could have been nearly as big as Nirvana, but they just decided that that's not what they wanted to do. It's like a unique type of music that I don't think is appreciated enough that it should be.
Graham, last question, and maybe a thanks to Grant as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks to Grant for his time and for such great comments on what is a great book. I mean, it's a very entertaining book and easy to read, but it's also a great work of social history. It feels like it's gone. It's like the slow uncovering of a lost. And people behave differently then. And Ben Aston Peel's radio show do a session in London. They haven't got the money. So when they bump it John Peel in Glasgow, John Peel gives them £150. I think, like, did that really happen?
It's so interesting. As you say, it is a world, it just could not possibly exist now, no matter like how hard we tried. And what was achieved, like we're speaking over Zoom, and with YouTube and Zoom, a lot of the distribution problems have gone. But to me, there's something that's been lost within that ability to do things easily, and it's just the attitude of like something's achievable, but you have to. I think I read there's like a quote by Bill Drummond, is how to have a number one hit, the KLF book, and was everybody's got great ideas, like your best friend has a brilliant idea, but the difference between having a great idea and seeing something through to the end is like very difficult, because it is difficult to put these records out and sort of like promote them yourself and do it. And I think that's something that's been lost. And my hope for this book is that young people do read it and they get inspired by these people that somebody who's come from nothing in a place, a small town, that the odds of you being on top of the pops are just so extraordinarily low. It can be done through hard work and having a good idea. And I think
It's a very romantic. It's a very romantic era.
Yeah, you're right. It is. It is.
As defined by the Rosillos.
Yeah, no, Brazil's are fantastic.
Or Revillos, I get confused which, but
Both.
Yeah, and but it's something to me that's like really important. This sort of like DIY attitude that people can literally go out and do anything they want, and this is like a guide. It's like a template that these pioneers have done that can still be achieved, because the means and tools are all there for young people now, and it's just the attitude I think these people had that wanted to get across that it's like there that
So do you think it's easier now than Grant? Last question from me.
I think it's easier in terms of like Bandcamp and YouTube and having recording studios in on your iPad. I spoke to somebody who's doing a project on very, very, very early Scottish punk music, and asked this person who'd formed a band in 1976 if he had any demos, and he said he didn't because they couldn't afford going to a studio, and anything they did in a cassette tape was recorded over and over again. So the tools are there, and I think young people, in terms of their ability to like craft songs, or like even better, it's like exciting, like how just artistically and attitude wise, like how great young people are. They do things better than I could ever do. But what's more difficult is that attitude, be able to cut through all the noise that's gone. And I think that the difficult part that's been lost. And I think from these people telling their story, that's what I hope people can do, is just like
the Herald had, I think, 100 singles of the year, all Scottish acts, and I have to say that an awful lot of them I'd never heard of. But on the other hand, I thought that was really interesting that a newspaper still took that much care in its detailed assessment of Scottish music and highlighting lots of independent young talents that was coming through. You wouldn't get that in a lot of newspapers anymore, and that was an interesting situation that the Herald still did that.
Yeah, it just the talent is there. It really is. It's just that there's so much of it now. And Graham had mentioned John Peel, and I think having somebody who's able to curate a lot of the stuff coming through. And that's why the Herald Top 100 was like great. You just need people to like curate things for people. Again, it's like, ironic. It's almost like the gates, the barriers have been so exploded.
Yes,
you need something to come back and sort of take, not close the gates again, but just have somebody to say, this is good, this is not good, this is good, this is good.
Also, to change the world, you have to start off by believing you can change the world, and that requires some naivety, which perhaps is lost now.
No, that's a very good point. Naivety is something that like just crops up so often in that story. People just hoping for best, and it's the stars aligning and it happening, or just it's like for me writing this book, I'd co-written a book before, so it wasn't the same. I was like slightly aware of having situations where people might want to speak about it, or people comment on it and whatever. And for people making records, it's like fuck records. The naivety of it is such an important thing that you can never get back.
You've been listening to the podcast Two Big Egos in a Small Car. Your hosts were Graham Chalmers and Charles Hutchinson. This was a Baltic sub-production.